The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, so I've got an important update to a story from yesterday, and it relates to the role that Donald Trump is going to be allowed to play in terms of editing and redacting the Mueller report before it goes public. And I have to admit, and why wouldn't I? I've never been anything but completely forthright and honest with everybody in the audience. I'm kind of depressed over the reaction to the Barr report related stories, not because most people are reacting incorrectly. In fact, a large contingent of our audience gets that the Barr report is a sham and that everything that's going on is ridiculous. But last night, as I was researching for today, I was sort of asking myself, who the hell am I talking to? In the sense that most of my audience gets why it's all ridiculous and they don't need to be convinced. And the people that don't and continue to say, David, you lied, you need to apologize or whatever, they're not going to be convinced by logic and reason either. So it was a very dark evening, I guess I would say, for myself. But to ignore the fact that this is going on also doesn't make sense. So let's just jump into it. Yesterday, per Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, Donald Trump was going to have several weeks of opportunity to decide what he wanted redacted from the Mueller report before a version of it is provided to the House of Representatives and presumably is made public. And just 16 hours later, Lindsey Graham has now completely reversed himself. He is saying that, no, there's actually no longer a plan to give a copy of the report to the White House for these redactions before the report is made public and or given to the House of Representatives. There's also a Justice Department official now that's corroborating this new version of the plan that Lindsey Graham says. So yesterday, Graham said Trump's going to have weeks to redact what he doesn't want made public. Now, the next day, Lindsey Graham is saying we're no longer, or William Barr, whoever, is no longer going to give Donald Trump that opportunity. It's possible that these are semantic games, that this is Lindsey Graham saying that's no longer the plan because between yesterday and today, the report was provided to Donald Trump. So now he can say and not be lying that the report will not be provided in the future tense because it's already been provided to Trump. I don't know. I mean, these people are liars. That's truly what they are kind of at the core. So to try to figure out if these are semantic games or an actual change in plans because of blowback or whatever, it's important, I guess, to think about that if the end goal is just to get to redact what you want to redact, they're going to find a way to redact what they want to redact, albeit maybe in a less cartoonish way than Trump's attorneys crossing out with a black marker what they don't want released. The other interpretation, I guess, someone pointed out that the word planned is in there, that there is no plan to give this to Trump to redact anymore. And that could be one of those things where there's no plan, but it might spontaneously be what happens or something like that. But for me, if we want to sort of analyze this along linguistic or semantic lines, the most important semantic game I'm identifying is that they are now saying William Barr is going to send a version of the report, a version, to the House of Representatives and potentially will be made public. And when I see a version, Pat, that to me immediately says there can be more than one version of any report, and that may be the semantic figure they are now hiding behind, a version which may not be nearly complete.
Yeah, there's a lot of red flags to go along with this latest update. I'm totally fine waiting a few weeks to see the full Mueller report. I think that sort of makes sense, right? The investigation was 2 years long. They may need time to make the right redactions and make sure that there's no national security sensitive information that gets out there. But after the House reviews it and redacts what they have to redact, I think it's time for the public to see it.
Yeah, and I want to mention that in a sense, this entire discussion over how long do they need and who gets final cut, sort of the equivalent of final cut in movie production over this thing, This is all predicated on the idea that it's actually really difficult to sift through the entire report and figure out what has to be redacted. Robert Mueller and his team, I'm sure, structured this report and the information so that it would be very simple to redact what needs to be redacted. And they may even have communicated with William Barr in the Justice Department about what should be redacted or flagged it in the documents in some way, shape, or form. The idea that it's just so complex to agree as to what truly has to be redacted for national security reasons, as Pat is suggesting here, is very hard for me to believe. And at minimum, the full unredacted version should go to the House Intelligence Committee, all of whom are cleared, as far as I know, to see an unredacted version of this report. And in the end, we can't fall for Lindsey Graham's games. There are no plans. A version is going to be released. It's all semantic games. And this is part of this broader carrying out of the cover-up duties of William Barr, plain and simple. I said this on Monday. I said it on Tuesday. I think it came up in some sense in the Wednesday program as well. William Barr was known to have a position that a president cannot be indicted for obstruction. William Barr was hired specifically to manage the Mueller report and the fallout from the investigation in exactly the way that he is managing it. And to pretend that it's even remotely surprising that this is what is going on is disingenuous, sort of at best, and willingly deceptive, deliberately deceptive at worst. Okay, we're continuing to talk about the Barr report. For a document that would totally clear the president, according to Donald Trump, Republicans are really working hard and going out of their way to prevent the Mueller report from being released. And for the second time this week, this is not me repeating the story from Monday, Tuesday. It's happened again. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has blocked a resolution which would eventually get the Mueller report released. Now, I want to remind you, the House of Representatives passed this resolution 420-0. Okay, that means unanimous with some people abstaining. Democrats and Republicans 420-0. Mitch McConnell blocked it earlier this week. Dianne Feinstein, senator from California, Democrat, tried to get unanimous consent for the Senate to pass this. And for the second time, Mitch McConnell blocks it. Feinstein said, listen, anybody with a brain understands that William Barr's 4-page summary of a summary doesn't tell us a damn thing. We need the full report. But McConnell just says no. He says William Barr is going to tell us if and when and which version of the report is going to be released. And of course, which version, increasingly a question after Lindsey Graham said that a version is going to be provided to the House of Representatives. And it's an important sort of procedural thing to understand is that Dianne Feinstein tried to pass this by what's called unanimous consent. Okay, any senator can ask for unanimous consent to pass a resolution. Every senator has to sign off on it, but any one senator who wants to block it can block it. And that's what happened here with Mitch McConnell. So that's what's happening with our elected officials, at least in the Senate. Meanwhile, a new poll shows that 84% of Americans want the Mueller report made public, never mind being provided to the House and Senate in an unredacted form. If you look among party lines, even 75% of Republicans want the Mueller report made public. This is according to a new Quinnipiac poll that was released this week. I've mentioned this before, okay? We don't have what's called a full democracy in the United States at this point in time. We have what's called a flawed democracy. These are not my terms. These are established terms that exist for describing the fullness of democracy in different nation states around the world. This is not like that silly democracy versus republic thing that some people on the right like to talk about. These are actual designations. A Princeton study has looked in detail at whether the United States is a full democracy or falls short of it. And what this means in practice is that in the United States, the level of public support for something, for a bill, for example, doesn't correlate significantly with the likelihood of it being made the law or being passed if it's not a matter of law. If you are very rich in the United States, or if you are a powerful and large corporation, what you want to see happen based on our legislative elected officials that is much more likely to become reality than if you are just an average person. So an example would be after Sandy Hook, the Sandy Hook shooting in Connecticut a few years ago, 85 to 90% of Americans wanted universal background checks with no exceptions, period. Couldn't make it happen. The fact that it was almost unanimous in terms of a desire from the public was not carried out by our elected officials. And in this case, 84% of Americans want the Robert Mueller report released in full. Mitch McConnell and William Barr are working very, very hard to prevent it. When we get it, Donald Trump may ultimately take pleasure in the fact that something short of the full report is what we are going to get. So when you look at how the United States is ranked in terms of the democracy index, we are not a full democracy. We are ranked as a flawed democracy. Flawed democracies are countries where the elections are basically fair and free, and there are basic civil liberties that are sort of honored in basically all circumstances. But there are sort of faults to the democracy. There are faults in terms of the development of the political culture, certainly an issue here in the United States. The level of participation in politics is a problem in flawed democracies, definitely a problem here. There are issues in how government functions and how government does or doesn't reflect the will of the people. Definitely a problem in the United States. So if you look at an index of democracy, you'll see that full democracies include countries, not surprisingly, like Norway and Sweden and Denmark. Australia and Canada are considered full democracies. The UK, Uruguay in South America is considered a full democracy. And then the second sort of level are flawed democracies by these same measures. And the United States is in that category. Greece, India, Italy are there. It's a very common category, actually. My home country of Argentina is designated a flawed democracy. And we're seeing that represented here. We need to see the full Mueller report. I hope that we will. The one thing working in our favor is that because desire to see the report is so high, hopefully it becomes a bigger and bigger political problem for the Trump administration and the Justice Department the longer it goes without being released. The caveat is very commonly in the United States, when something just kind of goes on for a while and becomes background noise, people forget about it or it's no longer sort of seen as a pressing issue. The fact that Donald Trump is in the White House, I worry, is one of those things. The energy that we saw after his election, in great part, has dissipated because it's become the status quo. And I wonder whether the voter motivation is going to be there to remove him in 2020. Along the same lines, 84% of Americans want to see the Mueller report. The longer we see it, it should become a bigger and bigger problem politically for the administration, except people may forget about it. One just other thing I was thinking about yesterday. Imagine for a second if in the Bill Clinton era, Kenneth Starr's report about the Monica Lewinsky, Bill Clinton situation had been boiled down to a 4-page summary written by Bill Clinton's attorney general. Would Republicans have accepted that as a full accounting of what the investigation contained, uncovered, and determined? I think we all know the answer to that. Send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at @DPakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show, and we'll be back right after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Maxwell Key. Maxwell, thank you for supporting the David Pakman Show. Really appreciate it. Great benefits are conveyed with membership, including the daily bonus show. You can also sign up using the coupon code THISIS2020 at davidpakman.com/membership. Today's longtime sustaining member of the day, Robert Johnson. Maxwell Key and Robert Johnson, two really good people who I am proud to say and inspired by their support. We have a David Pakman Show subreddit at davidpakman.com/Reddit. Nearly 10,000 of our viewers and listeners subscribed and participating daily in political discussion. A couple of interesting threads I spotted on the subreddit this morning that I wanted to call to your attention. The first of which is David can't admit he was wrong. That's a problem. That's Leonardo McLardo, who I'm sure is using some kind of pen name. Listen, I've already addressed this, and I, in fact, did an entire live stream about it yesterday, mostly focused around this issue. There's video of me from a year ago saying I do not believe, I think the chances of Trump having personally actively colluded with Putin in a deliberate way are almost zero. That's a quote. That's a quote from a video a year ago. So for everybody saying I was wrong about something related to Trump Russia or that I need to apologize, I need you to tell me exactly what, and I need you to provide citations, because it's been very, very frustrating when there are demands around something so vague and amorphous. And I think that anyone who seriously looks at the data, meaning the videos, will find that so far I have been spot on when it comes to the Russia investigation, which is we can all see plain as day what it is that took place. But if you are waiting around for Trump to be charged with anything related to collusion, don't hold your breath, because it simply was never going to happen, because that's simply not how things work. And on the obstruction piece, I think we've already delved into it. So I'm ready to provide any apologies necessary on the basis of you actually being able to cite something that I need to apologize for. Also from the David Pakman Show subreddit, did the Majority Report rip off Smallville? This is so funny. So there's been a sort of fake controversy over the last couple of weeks that our new set looks suspiciously like Sam Seder's set. But a number of people have pointed out that there are episodes of Smallville that have a sort of tiled background that looks a lot like Sam Seder's set, and of course predated. Is Smallville like is Smallville the Superman prequel type of thing? Like, I don't even know what show that is, Pat.
I don't know if it's a prequel. I guess it must be, because I think the main character is a teenage Superman, but I didn't watch it myself, so I can't vouch for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going by the evidence that's been presented, which is that Smallville had Sam's set long before he had it. So anyway, I don't know if we'll ultimately have a resolution here. I've retained Mark Garagos to represent me in the intellectual property lawsuit being brought by one of Sam's listeners. And I will have more news for you about the litigation very, very soon. But seriously, join the subreddit at davidpakman.com/reddit. Let's talk about Brexit. We've been following Brexit, which is the plan that the plan for the UK to leave the European Union. We've been following it since before the original vote even took place. And the day after the vote, I said, I don't know that we're ever going to actually see Brexit happen, at least not on the basis of this vote. And it still hasn't happened. There have been numerous failed plans outlining exactly how Brexit would be carried out. And it has now become so toxic and intractable that the Prime Minister Theresa May has said she is willing to resign if Parliament approves this latest version of her plan for how the withdrawal from the European Union will be carried out. Now, you might say, hold on a second, David. She wants Brexit and some others don't. So if she leaves, shouldn't they not do Brexit? It's way more complicated than that. This is an argument mostly between Theresa May handling Brexit versus Brexit still happening, but being handled by others, and Parliament taking a bigger role in this. So this was an initial plan for how Brexit would be carried out. The original plan, I believe 2 original plans have already been shot down. What Theresa May is now saying is if Parliament is willing to keep the process moving by approving this latest version of her plan for phase 1 of Brexit, she will resign and then allow lawmakers to step in and take care of the second phase of the plan. The European Union is saying that if this latest version of the plan gets approved, they're willing to extend the Brexit date to May 22nd, which, of course, has already been delayed previously at least one time. So there's a couple questions about the particulars of this offer from Theresa May. And then there are just kind of like some broader questions about Brexit in general. The main question is, okay, Theresa May is saying if the second or third plan is approved, she would be willing to step down. She needs to say when. And this is something I've been reading a lot of members of Parliament are asking for. Okay, she says she'll step down, but exactly when is it that she would step down if this version of the plan is approved, and demands for her to be more specific about that. But then the bigger picture of this is that Brexit has not surprisingly, I mean, exactly as we predicted years ago, it has been an absolute unmitigated disaster. You have British Parliament paralyzed to some degree. You have the embarrassment of the entire fiasco on the international stage. It seems that just on the merits, it would be acutely bad for the UK to have Brexit actually happen. And then most importantly, and we've talked about this before, Pat, if another referendum vote were to be held today, if they were to decide, you know, it's been so long, things have gotten so crazy, we have more perspective now about what would actually happen if we were to Brexit, it seems as though the referendum would not pass in favor of leaving the European Union anymore. And I don't know, Pat, if we've looked at polling data on that, but that also is arguably a consideration in what the next step should be.
It doesn't seem like if they held the vote again, the citizens would vote to leave the European Union like they did in 2016. Interestingly enough, after the 2016 vote, David Cameron decided to resign because even though he's a conservative, he wanted to remain with the European Union and reform it. How interesting would it be if a second British Prime Minister resigns over the Brexit fiasco? That would have to be a reason to redo the vote, in my opinion.
I mean, I don't know from a legal perspective what would legitimately warrant saying we are going to not act on the result of the last referendum and have a new one. But from a merely common sense perspective, I don't know what the hell they're doing at this point. And this is, I mean, yeah, my personal biases are that Brexit is motivated by and sort of connected to the nationalist streak that we've seen crop up in a bunch of European countries. This has happened in Hungary. We've seen it in Poland. We've seen it in France. We've seen it in Germany. There are elements of it in Spain. I could give you the full list. I see Brexit as tied into that, and I'm against that. I think that that's a negative influence, and I think it's something that should be opposed. So that's my personal bias. But on the basis of the particulars, at this point, I don't even know how you sort of ethically and morally justify going forward with what has been an unmitigated disaster, an embarrassment on the international stage, and more importantly, if you held the vote again, the people wouldn't want it. And I don't know what the limit, I mean, it's admittedly a gray area, right, Pat? If it's been 12 years since the vote and finally they get a plan together, it seems 12 years is pretty clearly like, okay, I think you got to redo the vote. But when you have a couple years, I don't know. I mean, there is sort of a gray area element to it in terms of how long do you have to execute on the referendum before it's null and void?
Right. Like, is it unethical to hold the vote again? Does that mean that you're usurping the will of the people? I guess you would be for the people's opinions back in 2016. But if everyone's opinion has changed so drastically because they know this is an unmitigated disaster, I think that does warrant holding the vote again.
I'm going to stick to what I said years ago. I mean, at this point, why not? It could really go either way. I don't think Brexit's going to happen. I think that one way or another, it is not going to happen. And I mean, listen, it's just as likely to happen or as unlikely to happen as it was when I first said this the day after the vote. But my prediction is that it does not happen and that over the long run, the UK will be better off as a result of that. We'll see, and we'll see ultimately if we get clarity on when is it that Theresa May is willing to resign, what is going to happen with this next version of the plan to leave. And I'm always open to hearing from our viewers across the pond in the UK about this, most of whom from the emails we've gotten over the years, I think are against leaving the European Union. Make sure to follow the David Pakman Show on Instagram at David Pakman Show. Follow me while you're there at david.pakman. We will take a break. Very interesting interview coming up next about a documentary on the Flat Earth conspiracy movement. Really, really interesting. Hope you'll stay with us.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Daniel Clark, who is a director, editor, cinematographer, and sound designer. Today we're going to talk about his featured documentary, Behind the Curve, which follows people whose lives have been completely consumed by flat Earth theories or hypotheses, the idea that the Earth is actually flat and that there's a worldwide conspiracy to cover it up. Daniel, thanks so much for joining me and talking to me about this.
Thank you for having me.
So how did flat Earth stuff first get on your radar?
It first jumped on our radar as a production team because one of our producers, Nick Andert, he's a Reddit guy, and he saw a lot of people talking about it. And like most people, he thought it might have been a troll or people just messing around, a joke. But the more we looked into it, the more we realized, no, it's an actual community of people, and there are a lot of people who really firmly believe this, and it's not a joke. And we're documentarians, so we decided, let's look into it even further and see if maybe there's a documentary to be made about this subject. And yeah, that's where it all started.
So as you get into this and start talking to people who have these beliefs, what's your sense of how people get pulled into the flat Earth ideology? And then we'll talk about how there's kind of two sides to it, two different ways in which it manifests. But generally speaking, like, how does someone get sucked into this?
I think in order to believe flat Earth theory, flat Earth conspiracy, you need to believe in you need to be basically susceptible to conspiracy thinking. And that's not to say you're not smart, and that's not to say you're not educated. It's just saying, like, you're willing to believe that people can conspire together in large numbers to do something bad or withhold something from everybody else. And so a lot of people get into it through, like, 9/11 truthers. Moon landing's a big one, especially for flat Earth. But there's just tons of other conspiracies, and flat Earth is kind of at the end of the spectrum, I would say.
Okay, so I mean, when you say it, so is it common that flat Earth is not the only conspiracy theory that the people you talk to believe?
Absolutely. Most people believe if you can believe that there's a worldwide government conspiracy to cover up the fact of the shape of our Earth, then you can pretty much be open to believing any other conspiracy that's out there, because those seem like peanuts compared to flat Earth.
What is the claim, or maybe there's more than one, and that's totally fine, that the flat earthers assert for why anyone would want to cover up the true shape of the Earth?
Oh, goodness. Well, I would say that a lot of flat earthers claim that people didn't know the shape of the Earth until the 50s, until the space program launched rockets up and then realized the shape of the Earth. And from that point on, they immediately got together, the worldwide governments got together to hide it from everybody else, because it would mean that they were wrong. And admitting that kind of wrong in this paradigm shift would lessen the government's power over the people. So hiding it from us seemed, in the flat Earth conspiracy ideal, hiding the shape of the Earth keeps power in the governments and the powers that be.
So it's not that a flat Earth versus a spherical Earth is necessary for some other thing. It's simply the idea that because governments said that the Earth is spherical for a while, admitting that they're wrong would diminish their power in some kind of general way.
That's true, but also I think it would admit that there's some sort of creator. So if the Earth is a globe and we're in space and the Big Bang and all that, there's not a real strong, like, there can be a big argument for atheism. However, if we're in a domed, flat creation, then there is 100% a creator. And I think some flat earthers approach it from a religious angle, which means that there is a creator, and, you know, the firmament is referenced in the Bible, and there's a lot of flat Earth talk in the Bible. And so it would kind of prove that there is a God if the Earth is flat, in a way.
This is so interesting to me because we've talked a lot about the anti-vaccine movement on the program. And one of the interesting things about the anti-vaccine movement is that it has an enclave that exists on the political right and an enclave that exists on the political left, which have kind of come together. So on the right, anti-vaccine sentiment is often catalyzed by a skepticism of the government as an advocate for vaccination. On the left, it tends to be more related to skepticism of big pharma, and they have kind of come together, and sort of unlikely allies ending up on the same page. Is there a similar dynamic, and it sounds like you're saying there is, with the flat earth stuff, where there is the religious sort of side, and then there's the kind of skeptical of government or science side?
Yeah, I would say that's definitely true. There is a religious component to a lot of people's belief in flat Earth, but there are people who I wouldn't call atheists because I don't think you can be if you're a flat earther, but they do seem to come at it from a very secular point of view.
Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned the dome, the idea of the Earth is flat within a dome. There's two primary flat Earth models. There's the dome and then there's the infinite plane. Can you talk a little bit about them and whether this is like a controversial thing within the flat Earth community?
Sure, I'll try to be brief. So the dome model, both models essentially, for the most part, begin with the North Pole being in the center, and instead of Antarctica being at the bottom of a globe, it's actually on the perimeter of this circle. So it's the North Pole in the center and the South Pole on the outside. And that is enclosed by a dome, and the dome is some sort of display system. There's another belief that there's no proof of a dome, so therefore it's possible that Antarctica is just the start of this infinite plane that could go on, and there could be other domed planets or other flatter Earths, so to speak, outside of our own. And there is a bit of a divide in the community. I wouldn't say it's necessarily 50-50, but there is some sort of divide on we don't know what's out there, so we can't say anything for sure. And yeah, it's the dome, I would say, is the most popular model, so to speak.
So in talking to people for the documentary, did you experience that there is, or let me frame it a different way, what is the feeling of those within the flat Earth conspiracy community about those who aren't believers? Is it that they simply have not decided that the evidence that they put forward is compelling yet? Are they seen as more sort of hostile enemies that need to be dealt with? What's the perspective?
No, I would say, all the flat earthers just started, becoming flat earthers within the past year to 3 years. So there's not a lot of animosity. A lot of the questions I got was, you've seen all this evidence, how are you not a flat earther yet? So it's kind of like, I would say they're more interested in showing you the evidence that led them to their belief. So it's more of a welcoming community. There's no, with the exception of scientists and people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye, there's not really like an us versus them enemy situation.
Is there sort of like a danger that you have identified within the flat Earth community associated with the belief, in the sense that, for example, if you believe the science on vaccines, you understand that not vaccinating actually presents a very specific health risk, both to the people not being vaccinated, to people around them who can't be vaccinated, herd immunity, all of these concepts. So there's like a very specific health risk we can associate. Is there anything that you've identified that is similar with believing in flat Earth conspiracies, or is it relatively benign?
I would say for the most part, it's not a harmful conspiracy to believe in. However, if you live your life without any trust in any kind of source, in any kind of government agency, in any kind of authority figure, then where do you start trusting? And how can you be able to be a member of society? And if you're raising family, like, what does that mean for your children and their belief in any kind of authority figures? Because there's good science out there that we should be embracing, but a lot of flat earthers look at most scientists as having an agenda, and it's kind of like the idea of anti-vaxxers and big pharma, like they're out there to make money, so we shouldn't trust them. And I think not having any faith in any kind of institution is really problematic for our existence and our success as a society and as a race of humans.
What do you think is the goal of the flat earthers? I mean, I know, so like the immediate goal would be get everybody to believe what they see as the truth, right? Which is that there's a flat Earth. But imagine that they do that, right? Imagine that the flat earthers succeed and there becomes this, a consensus arises that the Earth is actually flat. Then what? Like, in other words, what would be the implications from a practical perspective, if there even are any? Or is it just for them about, we just want people to believe what we see as the truth?
Well, if there was a consensus, I think we'd start seeing expeditions to the edge. And I think that's what's interesting about humanity, is if we know there's a dome and we know there's an edge, we're going to go touch it. We're going to go try to see what's past it because we're curious humans. So I think it would kind of be, The same as it is with space. We try to set up agencies and see what's out there.
So it's not that there's sort of a particular life-altering implication for day-to-day lives if we simply recognize that the Earth is flat as they see it.
Well, I would say then the trust of government is going to collapse, and any kind of authority in NASA and any kind of scientist is going to completely be gone. So we'll have to start building that from scratch. Trusting on, like, if, for instance, it was discovered that the Earth is flat, then everybody would be wrong up to this point, except for the flat earthers. So who do we trust anymore?
One thing I've been thinking about is if we think about the role of religion earlier in the sort of history of modern humans, there was likely some kind of like evolutionary advantage to being part of whatever religious group was in your immediate area. It probably increased cooperation, and in some way it made it more likely that you would live long enough through that cooperation to pass on your genes to kids. So there's this kind of evolutionary advantage idea to religion at some point in the history of Homo sapiens. Do you get a sense that there's kind of like a similar community element and cooperation element for members of this particular conspiracy theory that might apply in a sort of pseudo-religious or dogmatic sense, and that maybe community that's lacking elsewhere is found in these beliefs?
Yeah, and I would say that's true of a lot of things on the internet, a lot of different beliefs and groups on the internet. And I think Flat Earth is just one of many. The conferences and the meetups that happened that we went to, very nice. Everybody was having a great time. It's not like necessarily like a stale environment. Everybody's out there having, pizza and beer and just chatting up their conspiracy theories, and everybody's willing to listen, and it's a very open group. So if you're a flat earther and you go to one of these meetups, there is no deterrent to do it again and continue being part of this group, because it's a welcoming, embracing community.
Outside of, okay, so I guess I have to couch this. You said it's not that common that the flat earth conspiracy belief is the only conspiratorial belief for most flat earthers. But aside from conspiratorial beliefs of this kind, do you find that generally speaking, the people you interacted with have relatively sort of well-adjusted views on other elements of humanity, like on economics, for example, or on medicine or whatever else? I mean, is it other than these conspiratorial beliefs, are there other perceptions about the world around us relatively well-adjusted and accurate?
Yeah, I would say for many of them, yes. But just like with any group, and it's not even specific to Flat Earth, you're going to find people who don't want any part of any of that, kind of disconnecting from society. But I would say, generally speaking, yeah, I mean, they all have families, they get along well, they're very social. It's not like they're just these antisocial people who sit in a dark room all day. They're very out there. They've had jobs. They've done a lot of successful things. And yeah, I don't really see it as being an issue of, not believing in anything and kind of being strange on all fronts. It's just maybe this one specific thing with a history of a little bit of skepticism towards the mainstream, what's out there in the mainstream.
What's your best assessment after diving into this so fully for the time that the film was in production? What's your sense of like the best way to deprogram or disabuse folks of this belief? And, we could apply this to any conspiracy theory, but since you've been dealing with Flat Earth, what would you say would be the best or most likely path for people to exit these beliefs?
I think you can't, it's like with any strong belief, and this is true of anti-vax and climate change and all that stuff, you can't just present facts. Right. And then walk away thinking that it's going to change their mind. So the best you can really do, and this is from talking to a lot of people about this, is be kind, be willing to accept these people back into society. If they decide the Earth isn't flat, you can't chastise them for what they believe before. You have to embrace that. Okay, you have a place now if you want. It just being open to listening and talking to them and not shoving them away and not being mean and not insulting them, because that's not going to. Would that help you come back from any belief you held? I don't think so. Just being shamed or being berated is not going to make you say, oh, yeah, sure, let me change my entire view. Or should I just stay with the people who like me and embrace me?
Yeah, that's interesting. I recently read John Ronson's book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed on the Internet. And one of the things he talks about is that once you're sort of irredeemable as far as popular society is concerned, that's actually more likely to be damaging in the long term. And that it's important that one, in many cases, although not all, not be sort of tagged with this irredeemability. And it seems that applies to bringing people back from conspiratorial beliefs as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
The film is Behind the Curve. We've been speaking to Daniel Clark, and we will be linking to the film. Really encourage people to check it out. Daniel, really appreciate you talking to me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We basically knew that this would happen. Step one was the faux vindication of Donald Trump claiming to be totally exonerated when Robert Mueller's report literally says it cannot exonerate Donald Trump from obstruction of justice. And we've already talked about all of the other problems contained in the Barr report, which I've now explained, I think, enough times, some on the Monday show, some on the Tuesday show, some on the Wednesday show, that I'm not going to go through it all in detail again today. But part of that framing of total and unmitigated exoneration from Donald Trump was that he was the victim of something here. Despite 37 indictments, despite the report saying that Mueller cannot exonerate Donald Trump from obstruction, the framing that Donald Trump and the people around him have adopted over the last few days has been that the investigation represents an unfair, politically partisan attack on the president of the United States. That was phase one, okay? Now they're moving on to phase two, and we knew that phase two would happen, which is to start to accuse those who investigated him individually of wrongdoing. And in particular, Donald Trump is now accusing some particular FBI officials who investigated him of treason, which is a ridiculous standard to try to apply to what they did in carrying out their jobs for the federal government. But we'll get to that in a second. Donald Trump gave an interview to Fox News, to Sean Hannity, of course. This was his first interview, I think, since the Mueller report was handed over to William Barr on Friday, and ultimately we got the Barr report, the summary of a summary, on Sunday. And in this interview with Sean Hannity, Donald Trump says that individual FBI employees, Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, committed treason. This is the word that Donald Trump is using, treason, merely by participating in a legal FBI investigation, which is ridiculous, is kind of the only way I can say it. Take a look at this clip from the interview last night.
It was many months before that Strzok and Page were talking about the insurance policy, right? An insurance policy, just in case Hillary Clinton lost. They wanted an insurance policy against me. And what we were playing out until just recently was the insurance policy. They wanted to do a subversion. It was treason. It was really treason. If the Republican Party had done this to the Democrats, if we had done this to President Obama, you'd have 100 people in jail right now, and it would be treason. It would be considered treason, and they'd be in jail for the rest of their lives.
It's funny that he mentions if this was Obama, right? Imagine if what we have seen between Trump and Russia, we had seen between Obama and Iran. That's actually the Obama comparison that seems most relevant to me, which I actually saw James Comey bring up in an interview yesterday, I believe it was. And it can be really easy to lose sight of the facts when Trump is kind of hurling these generalized allegations in this way. You have to break it down into individual, sort of practical, answerable questions. Was the investigation illegal? Of course it wasn't. The answer is no. Was the investigation started on some kind of partisan pretense or with no probable cause? No. And in fact, the more we learn about, the more we realize all of the probable cause that sort of served as a catalyst for this investigation to get going from the beginning. So then we get to, did individuals break the law by being employed by the FBI and doing the work that they were told to do in terms of this investigation? Of course they didn't. And then we get to the allegation specifically of treason, which is the crime of betraying one's country by, especially by attempting to kill the sovereign or to overthrow the government. That's not what an FBI employee participating in a legal investigation is guilty of. Obviously, that is not treason. And when Donald Trump just throws out the nonsense in this way, it unfortunately kind of works. And I hope that most people, and I know that I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, in our audience, I think people understand working for the FBI and doing what you're assigned to do is not treason. But I know for sure that I will start getting voicemails and tweets and emails from Trumpists saying, it was treason, David. What the FBI investigators did was treason because it was part of an attempt to overthrow the administration of the president, Donald Trump. And that's why this is unfortunately effective. When Donald Trump goes on Fox News and he comes up with this stuff, the FBI agents who were doing the investigation are treasonous, it filters down. There is actually a sort of trickle-down effect. And I don't know, in 5 or 10 years, how is this entire fiasco going to be remembered? I don't know the answer to that. But I do believe that it's important not to forget that we had the Trump Tower Moscow deal. We had Trump firing the FBI director and admitting it was to stop the probe. Trump calling for Russians to hack Hillary's emails, which they did or maybe had already done, and Trump knew it at that point in time. Trump associates meeting with Russians in Trump Tower. We all know what we saw. We also knew that Trump personally colluding was not going to be the outcome, certainly not at least rising to criminality. We were all saying that for more than a year at this point in time. So the result of the probe that is no collusion charges against Trump really does come away. It was predictable and it was common sense from the beginning. But my concern here is the total whitewashing of the bigger picture, because the investigations continue. Mueller did indict 37 people, I believe it is. We need to get a full copy of the report. And when we allow things to sort of slide in the direction of crazy, and I would say the individuals doing the investigation being treasonous falls under the umbrella of crazy, it makes it really difficult to actually communicate the truth of what took place and is still taking place. And this is why I said at the top of the show, I was thinking yesterday, is it even worth bothering? Like, is it even worth researching and putting together stories about why the Barr letter is a joke and why the legalese is pointing to deception? Because once again, I think a lot of our audience gets it, and the people that don't are committed. I don't know if 100% committed, but 99.9% committed to whatever framing they are accepting from either Trump or from elements on the left that they find appealing. Maybe it's not worth it, and I just shouldn't talk about it anymore. I don't know. Let me know what you think. Does it make sense to continue to try to break this stuff down? What's really happening in 2020 Democratic polling? I think that it's kind of early to do daily updates about the Democratic primary polling. I think it's too early even to do weekly updates, but I do think that every couple of weeks it's worth checking in on what's going on with 2020 primary polling, because we're seeing some pretty interesting shifts. And most notably, and don't shoot the messenger, I'm not a Beto supporter, I'm just telling you what's going on. Beto O'Rourke has been surging since his formal announcement, and he is doing really, really well in terms of fundraising as well. We'll put up a variety of different polling on the screen for you. I've already said I don't see the appeal of Beto as a candidate, but if you look at the Beto O'Rourke polling over the last several months, you will see a definitive upswing since he announced that he is officially a candidate. You also notice that Joe Biden, who still has not announced his candidacy, is holding roughly steady. He's still leading in basically every poll, sort of polling between 26 and 35%, which is pretty significant. If we look at a different sort of slate of polls, you will notice all of the exact same trends. Bernie Sanders also holding roughly steady, ranging between 17 and 27%. Notably, Elizabeth Warren has kind of been trailing off. You will see that Elizabeth Warren in pre-Beto O'Rourke polls was as high as 13%. She's now polling as low as just 4% and as high as 8%. Her campaign just sort of struggling to get going. Also, I'll call your attention to Kamala Harris, who's been trailing off a bit. In the pre-Beto polls, she was in the 5 to 17 range. She's now not polling higher than 12% anywhere. So I don't know what else we can sort of say at this point in time, Pat, other than we know that historically the person that is leading in March of the year before the election does not end up being the nominee. That's important to remember. But otherwise, I don't know what else to make of the polling other than some people are having a hard time getting their campaigns going.
Yeah, the Beto thing is interesting. I would not have guessed that. I don't see the appeal, but that's for me personally. I could see that some people, they may think that Beto reminds them of Obama. He has a very similar cadence and demeanor. And maybe they just want to go back to those old days. That's exactly why Joe Biden is leading most of the polls right now, I think. Based on what we've seen in the past 2 years from the Trump administration, people just feel nostalgia for that time. And they want to go back to the Obama era. And I think Biden and Beto offer them that.
People, I'm sure, will be pointing out that Andrew Yang doesn't appear in any of these polls. That's true. I mean, nationally, he's not polling 1% in just about any poll. He says in Iowa he's making some impact, although I haven't seen that polling. He's going to be back on the show next week. And speaking of which, let me know what you want me to talk to him about. I know some people have concerns over Andrew Yang's UBI plan. Some people are concerned about Andrew Yang's opposition to college tuition being paid for through taxes. So he will be back next week. If you have topics that you want me to broach with Andrew Yang, please let me know. I'm looking forward to talking to him. We have a voicemail number on the show. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. And the voicemail line is made possible by our friends over at Linguist, who make it possible to learn a foreign language incredibly fast with their spaced repetition AI algorithm. I have been making massive progress in improving my French using Linguist. You can try it for free with no credit card at linguist.com/Pakman. That's linguist.com/Pakman. Okay, here's today's voicemail making a inquiry about tribalism and political labels.
Hi, David. My name's Daniel out of Houston. I had a question about how you label yourself as a leftist. I had a thought recently that perhaps calling anyone as any sort of tribal label might be disruptive and destructive towards public discourse. So how do you feel about people self-identifying without any label? Just say, I like to watch the news, I like to pay attention, I'm not sure what I am. Let me get your thoughts. How we going?
See, here's the thing. I agree that there is a discourse destroying effect of people attaching themselves to tribal political labels. But the reality is that we need some labels. Let me give you an example. When I say to someone, they say, what do you do at a cocktail party? I say, I host a political talk show. They say, oh, what's the bent of the show? It's not really practical for me to say, well, it's a show focused on media literacy that is pro-choice, pro-LGBT rights, against supply-side economics. You need to have some kind of shorthand to serve as a way to start conversations without needing an hour introduction to what one's politics are. So I recognize the good faith nature of what you're trying to point out, and I don't disagree with you that political labels reinforce tribalism in many ways and in many contexts. But to say that we should not identify with any labels at all anymore, I actually think would make it it would be a type of sort of cartoonish ideal fantasy that would actually prevent us from even engaging in a lot of the conversations that we need to have. So I understand what you're saying, but I think there's a sort of practical element to it that we can't ignore. We've got a great bonus show for you today. Become a member, become a patron to get instant access to the bonus show. I'll speak to you then in just a couple of minutes.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.